There are many names whispered in the hills of Appalachia, families spoken of only in hushed tones, warnings passed down like scripture. But among them all, the name Mercer carries a weight that makes even hardened locals shiver. Unlike other clans that stalked the woods or hid in farmsteads, the Mercers lived in the shadows of the dead. They were not hunters of the living, not at first. They were grave robbers, corpse collectors, scavengers, who believed death was not an end, but a larder. The story begins in the mid-1800s with Silas Mercer, a failed undertaker who arrived in a quiet Appalachian town after being accused of desecrating graves in Virginia. He set up shop on the edge of town, offering funeral services for cheap. At first, people welcomed him. Burying the dead was costly, and Silas charged half the usual fee. But soon, strange rumors spread. Graves managed by Mercer seemed to collapse unnaturally fast. Bodies interred under his care sometimes went missing entirely, their coffins empty. And more disturbing still, locals swore they saw smoke rising from his chimney at odd hours, the stench carrying on the wind like roasted meat. It wasn't long before Silas vanished from the town entirely, taking his wife and children with him. He left behind an abandoned funeral home filled with broken coffins and stains no one wanted to investigate. The Mercers retreated deep into the Appalachian hills, where they built a homestead not far from an abandoned cemetery, one that had been forgotten since the early pioneer days. There, surrounded by decaying gravestones, they dug in. Generations of Mercers grew up playing among the dead, their games twisted versions of funeral rites. They desecrated old coffins, tore bones from graves, and passed down Silas's belief that consuming the dead was a gift. To eat the flesh of the departed, they said, was to rob death of its victory. But when the cemetery grew empty, their hunger turned elsewhere. Travelers, vagrants, even neighbors who wandered too close began to vanish. For the Mercers, a fresh corpse was not only a meal, it was proof that they had power over the grave itself. Local records from the late 1800s describe a surge of disappearances around the Mercer Hollow. Families traveling through the hills would find freshly dug graves disturbed, headstones cracked open, bones scattered across the earth. Hunters whispered about stumbling upon Mercer children playing with skulls like toys, and in the dead of night, lantern light could sometimes be seen flickering among the headstones, accompanied by the sound of digging. One of the most chilling accounts came from a gravedigger in 1892 who discovered a crypt collapsed into itself. Inside were dozens of skeletons, all gnawed clean, arranged in neat piles. At the center sat a makeshift throne crafted from coffins, where a pale, ragged man grinned at the horrified intruder. The gravedigger fled and told his story, but no one believed him, at least. Not until more graves began turning up empty. The Mercers were different from other clans. In one crucial way, they saw themselves as lords of death. While others lived in fear of sickness, famine, or isolation, the Mercers embraced the grave as their domain. They painted their faces with ash from burned coffins. They wore necklaces of teeth taken from their meals. And when they feasted, they performed a ritual that became known among locals as the Last Supper. They would set the corpse at a table, dress it in rotting finery stolen from coffins, and mock a funeral banquet before carving it apart. By the early 1900s, the Mercer name had become synonymous with desecration. Locals refused to bury their dead anywhere near Mercer territory, but that only drove the clan to range further. Old cemeteries throughout Appalachia were found disturbed, crypts looted, bones missing, and wherever the Mercers were suspected, rumors of cannibalism followed. The most horrifying story from this era is the so-called Mercer wedding. According to legend, one of Silas's grandsons took a young bride from a nearby town. Whether through trickery or force remains unclear. Days after the marriage, the girl disappeared. Her family, frantic, stormed the Mercer homestead. What they found turned their stomachs. A long banquet table set among the gravestones. the bride's bloodied veil draped across a corpse that had been served like a roast. The Mercers sat around the table grinning, their faces smeared with red. The girl's family fled in horror, never daring to return. Over the years, whispers of the Mercer Line grew like a sickness. Hunters avoided their hollow. Travelers took wide detours to skirt the old cemetery, and locals claimed that if you lingered too long among the gravestones, you might hear a voice calling to you, coaxing you toward an open grave. Those who followed often vanished, leaving nothing but disturbed earth behind. Even today, the ruins of that old cemetery can be found, the gravestones toppled and weathered by time. Locals say if you visit at night, you might see pale figures moving between the stones, their eyes reflecting like animals. They say the earth there never stays still, that graves collapse. Soil shifts, and sometimes, fresh bones rise to the surface, as if the ground itself is spitting them out. The Mercer Line wasn't just a clan. They were scavengers of death, parasites of the grave, and predators who turned cemeteries into hunting grounds. And if you believe the stories, their obsession with death gave them a hunger that never ended, a hunger that may still echo in the hills, waiting for the next unlucky soul to step among the gravestones. Asterisk by the 1920s. The Mercer name had become less a family lineage, and more a curse, whispered in the hills. Most of Appalachia had begun modernizing. Mines boomed, railroads cut through mountains, and towns grew into bustling centers. Yet the Mercer Hollow remained untouched, sealed off by its own foul reputation. Outsiders avoided it, and locals dared not tread near the broken cemetery. But the Mercers thrived in that isolation, their rituals growing more grotesque with every generation. It was around this time that stories began circulating of the Mercer procession. Locals swore that on nights of the new moon, shadows could be seen winding down the hills in single file. Mercer men, women, and children carrying lanterns and dragging shovels. They would march into graveyards far beyond their own hollow, exhuming bodies and hauling them back. Witnesses claimed to see them walking barefoot, their faces powdered in grave ash, with bones tied into their hair like ornaments. Children would cry at the sound of the procession's distant chanting, a low, droning hum that carried eerily on the mountain wind. But the Mercers were not content with graves alone. They began targeting the living more openly. Rural newspapers from the 1930s carry vague reports of disappearances in counties near the Mercer Hollow. A traveling preacher never made it home. A pair of newlyweds vanished during their honeymoon trek into the mountains. An entire family of settlers was found slaughtered, their cabin stripped bare, though oddly, the bodies were missing pieces, as if carved like livestock. It was in this decade that a legend solidified. The Mercers believed that the soul could be stolen. Eating the flesh of the dead was no longer just about sustenance, it was about absorbing power. Local folklore insists that Mercer children were raised to believe they carried the spirits of their meals within them, that every bite added another voice to the chorus of their bloodline. This obsession made their rituals increasingly elaborate. They didn't just eat, they held mock funerals for their victims, complete with prayers and hymns, twisted into something unholy. Survivors few, as they were claimed, the family would seat the body upright, chant around it, and force the youngest Mercer child present to take the first bite, binding them forever to the clan. The outside world didn't entirely ignore the Mercers. In 1941, a WPA worker surveying land stumbled across the hollow. What he found was so grotesque, it sparked one of the few documented investigations into the family. He described half-buried coffins scattered in the woods, some with gnawed remains spilling out. Behind the old Mercer house stood a barn with hooks hanging from the rafters, some still dripping. Inside the cemetery itself, he claimed to see a pit filled with bones, stacked neatly, as though catalogued. He fled and reported his findings, but by the time authorities returned, the Mercers had melted back into the woods, their homestead abandoned. That same year, America's involvement in World War II drew young men from Appalachia into the military. Yet no Mercers enlisted. Rumor says the draft board tried to summon them, but when officials arrived at the hollow, they found the homes eerily silent, the cemetery filled with fresh earth, as though the clan had buried something or someone there. Locals insisted. The Mercers had gone underground, literally, digging tunnels beneath the hills and building hidden crypts where they could continue their feasts without detection. By the 1950s, the Mercer legend reached its darkest point. Teenagers dared one another to trespass into the cemetery. Few returned, and those who did described scenes so nightmarish they refused to speak of them for years. One boy finally confessed on his deathbed in the 1980s. He and two friends stumbled into the hollow one summer night. They found candles burning among the graves, dozens of Mercers circling a fresh corpse laid on a table. He said they weren't eating yet, they were singing, their voices high and shrill, as though mocking a church hymn. When the corpse's head twitched, he realized with horror that the victim was still alive, drugged or paralyzed. The boys fled, but only he made it out. His friends were never seen again. The Mercer Hollow became a forbidden zone, a scar on the map where locals refused to tread. Hunters swore they could hear voices in the trees, calling their names in familiar tones. Travelers vanished on mountain roads that cut too close to the old cemetery. And hikers who dared to camp near the hollow awoke to find disturbed soil around their tents, as though something or someone had been digging beneath them. Perhaps the most unsettling twist in the Mercer tale came during the 1960s, when construction crews expanding a highway unearthed an underground vault near the hollow. Inside were dozens of mummified bodies, seated upright, their mouths forced open with wooden wedges. Carved above them was a single phrase, "We feast forever." The vault was hastily sealed, the discovery quietly buried in state records. 2. This day, locals insist the highway bends unnaturally at that spot not because of terrain, but because the state wanted to cover the vault without disturbing it further. But if the Mercers truly retreated underground, they did not vanish. In fact, sightings increased through the late 20th century. Drivers on lonely mountain roads reported seeing pale figures watching from the tree line. Cemetery caretakers found graves robbed with surgical precision, the bodies taken but jewelry and valuables left untouched. And in one especially chilling case in 1979, a group of spelunkers exploring a cave system near the hollow discovered what looked like a dining chamber carved into the stone. Long tables built from coffin wood filled the space, and at the center sat a single fresh carcass still warm. The explorers fled, but when they returned with authorities, the chamber was empty, save for a trail of bloody footprints leading deeper into the caves. The Mercer Line had evolved from grave robbers into something far darker. They were no longer just consumers of the dead. They had become curators of death itself, building hidden chambers, collecting corpses like trophies, and weaving their lives so closely with death that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. And even now, locals swear the Mercers never died out. They whisper that certain graveyards are still claimed, that anyone buried there risks joining the Mercer table. Families bury their dead in secret, often cremating rather than risking the earth. Because in Appalachia, fire destroys what the Mercers cannot eat. By the late 20th century, the Mercer Line had become less of a family name and more of a legend, so grotesque that most outsiders dismissed it as local folklore. But for those who lived in the shadow of their hollow, the Mercers were no myth. They were a looming presence, proof that some horrors can endure in silence for generations. And as the decades passed, new stories suggested the clan was far from gone. They had simply adapted, hiding in plain sight, feeding on the dead when graves ran dry, and the living when no one was watching. One of the most unsettling modern accounts comes from 1986. When two gravediggers working a rural cemetery in Kentucky claimed to have been stalked by figures lurking beyond the fence line. They described pale, thin shapes, crouching low in the tall grass, moving with unnatural silence. At first they assumed it was just teenagers pulling a cruel prank. But when they shone their flashlights, the figures scattered on all fours too fast, too fluid, like feral animals. The men fled, but the next morning, several coffins from the previous week had been unearthed. The bodies were gone. Throughout the 1990s, a wave of disappearances plagued hikers and campers in Appalachia. While many were written off as accidents, some families insisted something darker was at play. In 1994, a group of college students, camping near the ruins of an old cemetery, vanished without a trace. Weeks later, their tent was found shredded, their gear scattered. But the strangest detail was that the fire pit still held scraps of charred bone, not animal, but unmistakably human. The Mercer legend grew darker with the arrival of technology. In the early 2000s, grainy footage began circulating on underground forums, shaky handheld recordings supposedly taken in abandoned crypts. In one, a group of explorers entered a stone chamber deep in the hills, their flashlights sweeping over what appeared to be a table laid for a feast. On it was a human body, jaw forced open in a grotesque grin, while shadows moved just beyond the light. The video ended abruptly, the camera crashing to the ground. Neither the explorers nor the original tape were ever verified, but locals swore the chamber bore the markings of the Mercer Hollow. Even more chilling are the alleged recordings of the Mercer chant. In 2008, a pair of ghost hunters captured audio near a forgotten cemetery. Amid the static came a low, droning hum, layered with voices that seemed to rise and fall like a twisted hymn. Experts who analyzed the clip described it as multiple voices, speaking in unison, too uniform to be random background noise. Locals, however, had another explanation. It was the Mercer family, still practicing their rituals, still feasting in the dark. What separates the Mercer Line from other Appalachian horrors is the persistence of their obsession. They were not content with survival alone. They sought dominion over death itself. In their twisted worldview, to eat the dead was to rob the grave of its power, to become immortal in spirit, if not in flesh. That obsession with defeating death has carried through their bloodline, making them more than cannibals. They became archivists of the grave, collecting corpses, cataloging bones, and carving crypts to preserve their legacy. Modern search parties that have dared to venture near the old Mercer cemetery report evidence that the family is still active. In 2012, a group of urban explorers claimed to find a hidden tunnel beneath a ruined chapel. Deep inside, they discovered shelves stacked with skulls, each one marked with crude carvings, names, dates, and symbols of crosses scratched out. They fled, but when they returned with authorities, the tunnel was collapsed, as though someone had sealed it deliberately. To this day, hikers and campers whisper of seeing pale faces watching from the tree line, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Farmers near the hollow claim to find disturbed earth in their fields, as though someone or something has been tunneling beneath. And most chilling of all are the modern funerals where freshly dug graves are mysteriously disturbed within days, the coffins found empty. Locals insist that the Mercers still claim certain cemeteries, and burying a loved one there is like serving them a feast on a silver platter. The Mercer Line may not be a clan in the traditional sense anymore. Perhaps the bloodline has thinned, or the family dispersed, but the rituals remain, the hunger remains, and the legend only grows darker with every missing traveler, every disturbed grave, every whisper of voices in the cemetery at night. If you walk among those gravestones and feel the ground shift beneath your feet, remember this: the Mercers don't see death as an ending. They see it as a doorway, and to them, every corpse is an invitation, every body, living or dead, belongs at their table. So the next time you pass a forgotten Appalachian cemetery, and you notice the soil looks freshly turned when it shouldn't, step carefully, because the Mercer Line might still be waiting, watching from the shadows, ready to claim another feast.